Okay, so welcome to this knowledge pool session on managing stakeholders. This is part of our project management training. So these are our normal housekeeping rules. If you want to just review these, you can do so on the YouTube recording. So what we're going to look at in this session is we're going to understand how stakeholders may best be managed. And the process is I'm going to deliver a presentation. There'll be an opportunity to ask questions, but there's no assignment as part of this particular session. The payoff is that you'll have an understanding of the roles and the tasks that are involved in stakeholder management in projects. So some of you may remember this diagram. This is our generalized model of a business. And what we're trying to show here, amongst other things, is who the stakeholders of a project are. So we introduced this model when we were describing the scope of a project, and we said that the scope of a project was its planned impact. So what are all the things that we're going to impact with this project? That's its scope. And you can see that we have a group of people that we might impact with our project. Anybody who is a person who's going to be impacted by a project is called a stakeholder. And you can see on this diagram the different categories of stakeholders that we might have. So inside the business, there would be employees. Outside of the business, there would be suppliers, customers, shareholders of the business, regulators, and the public. These are all people who might be affected by a particular project. So this is who the stakeholders might be. And we'll see as we go through this session that one of the tasks is to identify who the stakeholders are and to think about how we engage with those stakeholders, because there are different ways that you can engage with people if they're an employee of the company versus if they're shareholders. You can't just send an email to all the shareholders if you're going to be affecting them. There are protocols, there are different ways of contacting people and engaging them. But this is basically who the stakeholders are or might be. They're the people who are impacted by a project. So we need to think about, why do stakeholders need to be managed? Well, it's to allow the projects to run efficiently and to avoid problems. If stakeholders can engage with the project in a random fashion, the project is going to spend more time dealing with these engagements rather than delivering what it needs to. So managing stakeholder engagement allows the project to be efficient at stakeholder engagement. It means that we're doing stakeholder engagement as a planned activity rather than as a reaction to something that's happening. And we can think about the reasons why we manage stakeholders as also being to avoid the problems that happen if we don't manage stakeholders. So what can happen if we don't manage stakeholders is there can be a lack of support from them. If we don't explain the project, if we don't explain what we need from stakeholders and when we're going to need it from them, then the stakeholders will have a hard time responding to the project and supporting to the project in a timely fashion. There might be complaints about the project. Stakeholders can complain if they've not been engaged when they think they should have been, or if they don't think they've been engaged early enough in the project or engaged in the right way. So we need to understand how stakeholders expect to be engaged and what their expectations are. How timely do we need to engage them? And also, a project's deliverables may not be accepted by stakeholders. So when the project is ready to deliver something, like a learning management system like we were discussing last night, if we haven't engaged with the stakeholders, then the stakeholders might not be prepared to accept what the project is delivering. So we will tend to try to engage stakeholders to define the deliverables that are needed and to help test them to show that they really meet those stakeholders' needs. So that's why we need to manage stakeholders. So we need to think about what the first steps are in managing stakeholders. Where do we start? And the first step is to identify who the stakeholders for a project are. And to do that, we need to understand the impact. At the start of a project, it's often very uncertain who's going to be impacted and what's going to impact them. So we can expect that our initial stakeholder map that we might draw is going to be incomplete, and that we'll have to extend it as we learn more about what the project's going to do and who it's going to affect. But we need to start drawing that map so that we can extend it. Using this model of the business that we looked at on the previous slide gives us a way of doing an impact assessment to say what areas are going to be impacted, what systems, what processes. And if we know what systems and processes are going to be impacted, we can look at who uses those systems, who runs those processes. And this is a way that we find out who the stakeholders are. So any organizational chart that's available can be a very good source of information as to who should be approached when a project wants to engage with a particular group of stakeholders, because we may need to seek permission to engage with them. So if we go in via the organizational map and we find who manages a particular department, if we can go to that department head and say, look, we're running a project, we're going to be affecting the systems you use, we'd like somebody from your department to represent your department to the project, that department head can have a think about who would be the best person to represent their department so that we don't have to talk to lots of different people. This is about being efficient with how we engage stakeholders. So it's often the case that senior managers will want to be kept aware of the project, but they will want to appoint somebody more junior to engage with the project on a day-to-day basis. And generally, the senior managers will expect to get their information from the person that they appoint. But it's important to make sure that the same information that is coming out of the project generally ties in with the information that that senior manager is getting from the person they've appointed. Because if the senior manager starts to hear different information via different routes, they may start to question whether the project is competent, because the project is expected to manage the communications that come out of the project so that the same story is heard by everybody in the same way. So this process of finding the stakeholders, understanding who is in charge of those stakeholders, and understanding how the stakeholders and their management expect to be engaged is a process that's called stakeholder mapping. We're basically trying to draw a map of who's affected by the project, who controls those people, and how are they going to be engaged so that we can engage with them efficiently. Okay. So some stakeholder groups have formal ways of engaging with them. Often somewhere like the IT department, they get involved in so many projects that if they didn't have a formal way of being engaged, then every project that was started would want to engage with the IT department in an ad hoc fashion. So often departments or teams that do a lot of project work, well, they will have a standard way that they expect projects to engage with them. So you should always check to see if a business area has a formal way of engaging with them and try to use that method, because if they have a formal way, then they've set that up to be efficient. So if you use that way of contacting them, that way of engaging with them, you will be efficient as well. The stakeholder map that you draw is a dynamic thing, because stakeholders come and go. Individuals can leave the business, new individuals can join the business. And a stakeholder map will need to be kept up to date to reflect people who are in contact with the project, so that if somebody leaves the business and they were representing the interests of, say, the IT department, we know that somebody new needs to be appointed to take their place, and we would update our stakeholder map to show who the new IT contact is for the project. And stakeholders can be a very good source of information about other stakeholders. So at the start of a project, when you're trying to find out who is impacted by your project, when you make contact with a stakeholder because you know they're going to be impacted, an important question to ask them is, who else should I be talking to? They will have questions for you about the project and what it's doing, but they will know information about the organization, and they can tell you, often very usefully, who it is you should be talking to. So always ask questions of the stakeholders that you manage to engage with. Who else should I be talking to? So we map the stakeholders. We then have to try and engage the stakeholders. And we've mentioned that we should use the correct channel. So if a department or team has a formal way of engaging with them, use that. We need to try to engage as early as possible, because if we don't, we run the risk of missing out on vital information that the stakeholders have for us. So we should try to engage with the stakeholders early in the project. Now, some departments, some teams, some stakeholders don't actually need to be engaged right from the very outset, but it's better to engage with them from the outset, agree that they don't need to be engaged at that point, but agree with them when we're going to come back to them, and make sure we come back to them at that point in the project when they start to be relevant. And those people will be pleased that you contact them at the outset. And we should try to ensure we engage in a consistent manner, so we're going out to the stakeholders in the same sort of way, so that we're not treating one group of stakeholders better than a different group of stakeholders. And this extends to keeping the stakeholders at the same level of knowledge. So one group of stakeholders shouldn't have a privileged level of knowledge unless there's a very good reason for them to do so, and that's been sanctioned, because it can cause problems if one group of stakeholders feels that they're not receiving the same level of information as another group. Now, many stakeholders will want to join the project steering group because they know that it's a way of influencing the project. It's a way of making sure that they get what they need. But there's a risk here, which is that the steering group gets too big. It becomes too unwieldy. It can't make the decisions that it needs to make because there are too many people on it. So it's important that any requests from stakeholders to go on to the steering group are passed to the steering group chairman, who is usually the project sponsor. And it's a part of the project sponsor's job to decide whether a stakeholder is going to be allowed to join the steering group, whether their input is sufficiently important to the project that their voice needs to be heard at the steering group. That's not to say that if a stakeholder isn't present at the steering group, their voice can't be heard. It just means that we have to work a bit harder to make sure that that stakeholder input, if it needs to be heard at the steering group, we need to make sure that it is heard. So somebody that does attend the steering group may need to stand in for somebody who wouldn't normally attend. Or maybe a stakeholder receives a one-off invitation to a particular steering group where a particular decision is going to be made that particularly impacts them, their department, or their team. So there are different ways to manage it, but we're trying to manage expectations here. We're trying to set an expectation as to how people are going to be engaged, how often, what sorts of information they're going to be receiving, and we're trying to meet that expectation. And the best way to meet that expectation is to have a communications plan. So a communications plan is basically a small plan that is part of the project plan, but it's particularly focused on planning what communications are going to go out from the project, what messages are going to go out and when and how a message is going to be released. Because if we can be consistent about how we communicate and we release the same information to all the stakeholders at once, we've seen time and time again that this is the best way of managing stakeholders. Okay. And for stakeholders that only have a limited interest in the project, ensuring that they receive a regular update, but no more information than they actually need, is something that you can plan out on your communications plan to make sure that you're having the right level of engagement with your stakeholders. Okay. So we think about roles and responsibilities here as well. So the project manager is principally responsible for the stakeholder mapping, for engaging the stakeholders, and for communicating with the stakeholders. But business analysts, software developers, testers, they have a role and an interest in stakeholder mapping. But I would say that particularly the business analysts have a particular role and interest in stakeholder mapping because they need to make sure that we're talking to all the right people. Anyone who knows about what the project needs to do or knows what the project is going to impact needs to have input to the business analysis that will take place. Although the project manager is primarily responsible for these activities, they can delegate specific activities. So for example, the project manager can ask a member of his team or a member of the steering group to take on a responsibility to engage with particular stakeholders. And normally that will be done, again, to make that efficient, because if the project manager tries to do all of the work of engaging with stakeholders and communicating with them, then they may not have enough time to actually manage the project as well. So we need to think about delegating some responsibilities away from the project manager so that they can focus on remaining in control of the project. So we may need to delegate engagement tasks to other people. And on very large projects, it may be necessary to appoint a communications manager. And the role of a communications manager is to manage the communications plan. So they will make sure that all the activities that need to be on the plan are on there, that all of the communications that need to be issued are drafted and reviewed, and that they are sent out at the right time to the right people. So on a very large project, it's not unusual to find that there is a communications manager who works alongside the project manager to make sure that all of the messages coming out of the project do so correctly. And I think probably the most important thing that any project manager can do is make sure that everybody on their team knows about these responsibilities, because anybody working on the project may come into contact with a new stakeholder. And it's important that if a new stakeholder comes into contact with the project and says, I want to be involved in this project, how do I engage with the project? The project team members need to know what to do about that. They need to direct the stakeholder initially to the project manager to make sure that stakeholder is captured as a mapping, so we know about the stakeholder and we know what that stakeholder is expecting from us, what they need from us. So it's important that every member of the team understands these roles and responsibilities so that new stakeholders can be directed to the project manager if they want to engage with the project. Okay, so this is actually the end of this short session on stakeholder management. So in summary, we can say that stakeholders need to be mapped and need to be engaged early in the project. It's really important that we find everybody that's going to be affected by the project and we engage with them to understand what they need from us and also to ensure that they understand what we're going to need from them and when we're going to need it. Because if we come to them late in the day with a request, they're going to struggle to meet our request. Whereas if we've prepared them and warned them in plenty of good time what we're going to need and when we need it, they may be able to be prepared and have done some work to make sure that they can respond quickly when we need that information. And engaging with stakeholders, it's primarily the responsibility of the project manager, but any member of the team can be asked to take a lead on engaging particular stakeholders. We would always recommend having a communications plan. On a small project, the project manager can run that communications plan themselves because it's part of their project plan. On a bigger project, probably having a communications manager, if one is justified, is a very good thing because the communications manager can run the communications plan and make sure that all of the communication that comes out from the project is as it should be. So that's the end of the session on stakeholder management. Can I take any questions that you might have about stakeholders and stakeholder management now?
Yeah. Hi, Tony.
Hi.
Yeah. It's just a quick one.
Sure.
You know, when it comes to stakeholders management, my question is, you know, at times it might be difficult to manage their expectations. Is it possible
yes.
for the stakeholders to actually prevent a project from going ahead?
It is, yes. And I've had experience of this where, because the engagement with stakeholders hasn't been very good, the stakeholders put up blockers. They find different ways. There are lots of different ways in which the stakeholders can prevent a project from being successful. One of those ways is to badmouth the project, to criticize the project to their managers, and their managers might criticize the project to their managers, and a kind of a bad news chain goes up the organization, and that can seriously harm a project. So this is one of the reasons why actively trying to manage your stakeholders, trying to find them, trying to engage with them, trying to meet their expectations is really important for projects, because stakeholders have a range of different ways in which they can stop a project being successful. One of the ways they can stop a project being successful is by holding back information. So if there's information that the project needs in order to move forwards, sometimes stakeholders can hold that information back, knowing that the project can't move until they release their information. So this is one technique that I've seen, and there are other things that stakeholders can do. In very bad situations, they can provide the wrong information to projects, knowing that it's going to delay the project. Because I guess one of the things that we haven't talked about particularly, so this is a good question because it allows me to talk about this briefly, is different stakeholders can have different views of the project. Some stakeholders can be very positive towards the project, and some stakeholders can be very negative towards the project. And one of the activities that you might carry out when you're mapping your stakeholders is to try to understand whether they are positive towards the project or negative towards them, because that might affect how you engage with them. You might want to spend a little more time engaging with people who have a negative view of the project. But it's a balancing act, because you run the risk, if you don't spend enough time with the people who are currently positive about the project, that they might become less positive about it over time. If you spend all your time talking to the people that weren't positive, you may start to influence them and they may become more positive, but stakeholders who were positive may become less positive if they haven't heard from you. So does that answer the question?
Yes, Tony, it does. Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you.
Okay. So good question. Thank you. Any other questions on stakeholders or stakeholder management? Okay, right. So what I'll do is, thank you. I shall stop the recording there.